In this video, I'd like to demonstrate doing a little bit of close reading of one specific document or artifact. So to start off with, I'd like to show you the front page of the Internet Archive. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit organization that is devoted not only to archiving the Internet. They do the famous Wayback Machine that you see at the top there. It lets you see old cached versions of websites so that if a website is changed or updated or removed from the Internet, you can see what it used to look like on a certain date, which is very useful. But the Internet Archive also acts as a giant digital library as well. As you can see, they've got millions of books, film clips, audio files, images, things like that. And most usefully for our class, they have thousands of images, scans of magazines, manuals, game boxes, other documents related to the history of video games. And they also have actual software that you can run right in an emulator. As you see here, 211,000 pieces of software are available. So let's now look to a specific object. I already searched this and brought it up, and this is the 1987-88 manual for Tetris, the Spectrum HoloByte edition, that is mentioned by Dana Plank in her article From Russia with Fun. This is the first manual that really presented Tetris as something specifically Soviet, as a marketing tactic. And so, as she points out, this is an American edition. The Russian stuff is absent, actually, from the British edition of the game for the Apple II, the Japanese version of the game. So this is specifically marketed towards Americans, and she talks a lot about that in her article about the sort of Cold War backdrop. And this is very, very late in the Cold War. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. And this box, the copyright date is 1987. Her article mentions it as 88. So, couple of features. So just number one, the Cyrillic to point out. You know, this sort of, here it's different, here it's different. Here they've actually used the Soviet hammer and sickle kind of logo. The caption down here at the bottom, I'm going to switch to a color that's not red. The caption down here at the bottom, the Soviet challenge, doesn't have the From Russia with Fun slogan, which I believe was on the Game Boy version. But very clearly, you know, St. Basil's Cathedral, a very famous piece of architecture from Moscow, all have been added to sort of make this look sort of Russian. And Planck cites Ralph Locke, this musicologist, who says, you know, a strong visual image goes a long way, and that just having this red and gold, very Soviet-looking sort of packaging gives the impression to people that the whole thing is Russian through and through, even though you've got original music in it, you've got J.S. Bach in it, and the gameplay, while it was invented by a Russian, based on his own childhood toys, is not, you know, specifically Russian. But the packaging goes a long way. So just to kind of page through a couple of interesting things here, you know, game manuals will have the same kind of copyright information that you see in a lot of books, dates, and things like that. A couple of things I want to point out. First of all is the art that we see throughout the manual. For instance, we see here, we see this rocket launch down in the bottom left. You know, the space race was a major source of tension in the very late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. The race to first put a man in space, which the Russians won, and then to next put a man on the moon, which the Americans won with Neil Armstrong in 1969. The space race is a major sort of aspect of U.S.-Soviet relations. Over here, I assume we have, this is like a Soviet fishing village over here. Then if we page through to the next page, one of the more interesting images is this stadium. It's sort of completed on the next page. And I can't help but wonder if that's a reference to the 1980 Olympics, which were held in Moscow, but they were very famously boycotted by a lot of NATO countries, including the US. So it's a famous event from a few years before the game came out, and I can't help but wonder if that's a visual reference to the 1980 Olympics. And then finally on this other page, we have the image of a Russian cosmonaut here in his space capsule. You can see it's kind of difficult to read. You can see the CCCP sort of USSR abbreviation on his helmet, other half of the stadium logo over here. So the manual, even as it walks you through like how to play the game, how to start the game, things like that, is full of Soviet iconography. Another interesting feature is the fact that the start screen here, it's a little bit difficult to see, but right in this star, it says Start Game, and the image it gives you is a map, an outline of the Soviet Union. So once you've figured out how your difficulty level is going to be, the Start Game is this star right over a map of the USSR. And the other thing I wanted to draw attention to, just as an interesting historical note, is you'll see up here, there's a description of this sort of copy protection scheme. And this was a very common feature of video games in the 1980s. What this is there's actually, you can see it over here, the game will actually ask you for a password. And so the reason for this is that it was actually very, very easy to copy software in the 1980s. A lot of floppy disks could simply be copied, directly to another drive. In fact, I can show you, I meant to show earlier that this particular edition is for the Apple II, and you can even see right here, the Apple II, a lot of them would have 2 disk drives, literally side by side, and you could just copy from one drive over to the other very simply. So pirating games was a big problem. It was very, very easy to do. And one of the things that publishers liked to do to try to dissuade that was to have this copy protection scheme where the game will ask you for a password, and it will tell you need to look up, for example, some page number, some line, some word in the actual player's guide. So it gives a little explanation of this. But this is a copying mechanism to make sure that you can't simply copy the disk. In order to play the game, you actually need to have the manual handy, which means that you need to have bought the game yourself, and that's designed to be something that's very difficult to share. I suppose you would have to make a Xerox copy of the entire book to be sure that it would work, or you would later find editions of games that had been cracked so that the copy protection scheme didn't work, and you could just type in gibberish and it would go through. So it kind of walks us through here, for example, if it gives you page 4, line 10, word 8, then you need to look at page 4, word 10, line 8. It tells you that word is going to be hand, right here. And if we look back a page, we can see we need to count 1, that was flip the page. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then 10 is the first word of this paragraph right here. Tetris will challenge even the most seasoned hand. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Wait a second. Yeah, I can't count. There we go. Hand is the 8th word anyway. So it's nice that they give you this little demo, since you wouldn't necessarily know that the caption at the top of the page is actually included in that count. So each time you would start the game, it would tell you to look up a specific page, line, and word number in the manual. So the last thing I want to show is just to sort of skip ahead and demonstrate, the value of the Internet Archive is that it really preserves individual artifacts in a lot of cases. It's nice to have what the Tetris logo looked like, but in fact we even have the box here. Where you can see it looks like this has sort of been flattened out. This is maybe the sides of the box that are flattened out, and then this is the back. So it's not the case for this one exactly, but there are objects on the Internet Archive where you might actually be able to figure out where they were sold. They might still have, a price tag sticker down here, might have the name of a computer store. This one you can see has been labeled by the store for, this is specifically an Apple II edition. And finally, that gives, some kind of information about the publisher. Sometimes it's fun to look these things up and see if they're still around, or see what they look like today. See if it's a Chipotle in an old where an old computer publisher used to be, or something like that, or if it's a generic office park in California, which a lot of them seem to be. But there's a lot of information that you can get out of looking up something on the Internet Archive. And in a little bit in the class, we will actually have a sort of midterm project in which you will look for a specific artifact of gaming. It could be a document or a piece of software that you find on the Internet Archive, or it could be something you actually have access to, like a Guitar Hero controller. But just looking at an item or an archival document or an object can sometimes yield some really interesting information and background and context in our study of video games and video game music.